Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Good morning, Andrew. Another week?
Another week, yes, another royal week. We're really sort of building on these royal stories. And some very, very good people, I think. Getting a bit of attention for them too in the papers.
Yes, another of our, well, you could probably explain. We reached the dizzy heights of the Daily Mail, I think, for the third time, didn't we?
Yes, I mean, they ran a story on Andrew Morton's discussion with us about what might happen to the Queen's private papers and the whole sort of concern that they're being vetted by her valet rather than a trained historian. So it'll be interesting to see how that runs. And I think we'll also get some attention for Di Davis. I think once they listen to that, there's some interesting things he said there about assassination attempts on the Queen, the fact that the royal family shouldn't be above the law. There are big questions being raised about some of the allegations against not just Prince Andrew, but also the King himself with some monies at Dumfries House. So I'm hoping maybe next week we'll be back in the papers.
Very good. Well, I mean, from the very serious to the not so serious, Andrew came to dinner. He came to this house for dinner with Mrs. Andrew, lovely Angela. You know, I sometimes tease Andrew about being a little bit of an old fart, bit of an old fogey, not quite of the 21st century. Tell him what happened, Andrew.
Well, we took the wrong. We're not used to going out of our little comfort zone in the centre of London. So we went out to see you in the sticks, and we took the wrong turning at the railway station. So after hours of wandering around, we eventually...
Why did you, Andrew? Don't you have maybe a phone, a mobile phone, perhaps? Many people have them.
Yes, I have heard about those, but no, we rely on maps and intuition. So we did eventually get there. And it was very good. It was worth the wait.
It was. We had a very jolly evening, and it was very amusing to see you wandering lost around the streets, utterly technologically inept. Never mind.
That's why I let you do all the technical stuff on this.
Yeah, that's why it looks so shabby. But actually, we've had quite a bit more feedback. We've also had some more charts. I thought we would. We're back in the charts in Ireland. We're back in the charts, slightly bizarrely, in Brazil. Quite low, but people are listening in South America and also in Italy and New Zealand. So people are paying attention, and we have more people finding the older shows. What's this one? I'm just opening up some of the older shows in front of me. I recently found your fantastic podcast, says Leslie Fisher-Ice. If you want to know who we are, your viewers and listeners, I'm from San Antonio, Texas, which is lovely. Looby number two tells us thanks us for our delightful little chats, which is good. Would like to be delightful. And another person says, I'm from the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. It's Gabrielle Butterfield, saying very nice things about the programs and how much she enjoys them and is looking forward to more. Isn't that lovely?
Well, I think we're going to try and talk to some of our listeners in future episodes and perhaps do Zoom links with them.
Yes, we are. We've been talking about this. We've had a couple of people putting themselves forward, and yeah, maybe a sort of 5 or 10 minutes at the end of one of our shows, getting people to ask us things that they want to know about, and challenge us about things, and tell us what they want to hear about in future. That'd be really good fun.
We had some feedback that actually sometimes the podcasts are a little bit short. I mean, we'd like to keep it quite tight, but I think we're stretching a little bit beyond that 40 minutes, sometimes up to an hour. And I think also we're keen that I think our acoustics are okay, but sometimes some of our guests need we need better acoustics there. So we're looking at that.
Yes.
So all this feedback's really helpful to us to try and get things a bit better.
Okay, and so to Diana. Now, this is the program I didn't really want to do, but I've overcome my objections. I've let Andrew sweet talk me, and actually, I think it's going to be really interesting.
I think so. I mean, it's interesting if you look at best-selling books on Diana on Amazon. Andrew Morton is still up there at the top, but actually just behind him are a series of books about the death of Diana and raising questions about whether it was an accident. And we're going to be talking to one of the people, probably the most comprehensive book on the death about it. But I'm hoping also we may get some comments maybe in future episodes from other people who investigated it, people like Di Davis.
Yes.
So I think this could be an interesting new area, and maybe your mind will be changed.
Well, look, the work I did on Diana was pretty comprehensive, but it was 20 years ago. And I relied to a great extent then for the final months of her life and her relationship with the Fayeds and what happened in Paris. I very much on a friend of mine, Martin Gregory, who wrote a book, which was the sort of anti-conspiracy theory book, a bit like Gerard Posner wrote the anti-conspiracy theory book on the Kennedy assassination. He did that, and I found it very plausible. And, as we've talked about before, the bigger the conspiracy, the less likely it is. And this one has to be very, very big to make it make any sense. It has to encompass security forces and ambulance people from 2 different countries and all sorts of things. But
and to be sustained for 25 years without anyone breaking rank. So it's a big ask.
I have read the book, and actually there are things we'll talk about in a minute that do make me think, okay, that's a bit weird. And certainly this guy who seems to have spent the best part of the last 20 years of his life going over every single detail of this day. He has indeed unearthed some interesting things.
Well, I suppose the thing about history is it isn't all neat edges, that there are some ragged things, there are things that are unexplained, perhaps in the chaos of the moment things happened. And I think one of the themes of the podcast is not conspiracy, but the fact that sometimes the cover-up is worse than the initial crime. And I think there's a suggestion here that certainly they didn't respond to the investigations perhaps as well as they could have done.
All right. Well, shall we get to it?
Yes, absolutely.
My open-minded face. Here we go. Paul, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about this book, this weighty tome, which you know a lot about.
Yes.
And unfortunately, John, who did, I believe, most of the work on the book, I'm sure you'll tell us more about that, sadly died a few years ago, but you know a lot about it and a lot about him. So if you want to give us some general introduction.
Well, if I give you the background, I worked with the journalist and humorist Victor Lewis Smith for about 40 years. And we made, in the early 2000s, a series of documentaries with Channel 4 with Keith Allen, the actor. And one of those was about Mohamed Al Fayed. And it was a kind of broadly sympathetic portrayal of Mohamed. And soon after that, the inquest into the deaths of Princess Diana and Mohamed's son Dodi were coming up. And he asked us if we would think about making a documentary about the inquest that was funded largely by Allied Stars, which was a film company he had. So we started preparing for that because it seemed an interesting topic. And then out of the blue, we got a book by someone, John Morgan. None of us had ever heard of him. I don't know if you remember, but about 9 months before the inquest started, there was the Metropolitan Police issued a report called the Paget Report, which had been overseen by Lord Stevens. And basically, the summaries of that were sort of saying it was all an accident. There's nothing to see here. But John had then spent the next sort of 6 or 8 months going right through the Paget Report and pointing out hundreds of errors and inconsistencies and downright falsehoods, in my opinion, certainly. And this book came all sort of perfectly itemized just before the inquest itself started. And we managed to get a contact email for John. And because he was in Australia, I'll tell you a little more about John's background in a minute. Because he was in Australia, he was very keen to know what was happening day to day in the inquest. So initially, we just struck up a relationship, and I sent him, because we had journalists who were sitting in every day in the inquest and listening not only to what was being said as the official inquest, but also talking to other journalists there and getting their opinions on what was happening. And we would send a weekly report back to John, and he in turn would send us lots of his information.
Right.
Perhaps I should just mention a little bit about John. I don't know if you've looked at his biography. He was born in 1957 in New Zealand, and he was a forensic accountant by profession. But in 2003, he got struck down with a terrible disease called multiple system atrophy. And basically his whole body became paralyzed. He could still sort of from the neck up, he could still speak, but he lost all his normal functions, digestion, and so on. And so he obviously, was in a wheelchair. He couldn't move. He had a wonderful wife, Lana, who looked after him constantly. But his mind was still absolutely clear. And he had that, being a forensic accountant, he had a very clear, precise mind. And he also, about that time, had started to become very interested in what he could see were a lot of unexplained factors about the death of Princess Diana. And so he started sort of analysing it, I think, to give himself a new purpose in life initially, probably as much as anything.
It is. I'm sure we're going to get onto the pros and cons and the whys and wherefores of the book, but it is an amazing achievement, and especially when you consider he was sitting there paralysed from the neck down, really just working through screens for, I don't know, best part of 10 years to produce it. But
well, it's extraordinary. Well, he didn't just produce that one, incidentally. I mean, on my shelf behind, I'll get them out if you like. There's about 10 altogether.
God.
The first one he did, as I say, the first one was on the Paget report, which was actually before the inquest happened. Which I don't know if you've looked at the Paget report, which was looking at the crash back in 1997. It's an interesting. Sorry.
No, we've looked through it. I mean, in essence, what is more John's argument? I mean, do you think in the book?
His arguments are that basically there was a cover up. I mean, John is very. I mean, I being a journalist, I'm a bit more equivocal about exactly what happened. I don't like to assume too much, but John is very clear that it was a targeted assassination of Diana, with other people dying, but Dodi and Henri Paul, the driver, just as collateral damage, and that it was organised by the intelligence services. I mean, he's very clear about that.
And why would they have wanted to kill her? I mean, and also, why do it that way?
Well, there are numerous reasons that he gives, and that I certainly would give some credence to. I mean, one is always the idea that, if somebody dies in a traffic accident, I mean, traffic accidents are banal. They're horrible for the people involved, obviously, but people die in traffic accidents all the time. So you just say, well, it was another accident. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why Diana at that time, by 1997, partly, she was causing a lot of trouble to the British establishment, certainly. I don't know if you've looked at the whole campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, there was a big international campaign at that time.
Yes, and she very much annoyed the government of the time.
Absolutely.
She was in quite a bit of trouble. I actually got a lot of kudos from others for that campaign. And yes, and John goes into that in some great detail. But the part of the book I found the most persuasive is the motive. There are lots of reasons, and he explains them in the book why they might want to get rid of her. And clearly, she herself thought that they might want to get rid of her.
Well, she dictated that note to Victor Mishcon. I mean, so to a lawyer, and Patrick Jeffson, who both of us know, was aware of this note.
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, she went. That was about 18 months before the crash happened, and there was a sworn note at Mishcon de Rea's office there saying that I've heard from security services that there are plans to have me killed or seriously injured in a road accident.
Yeah. And for people who don't know, for our viewers who don't know the intricacies of British life, Lord Mishcon we're talking about, he was Diana's personal lawyer, one of the most prestigious lawyers in the country from this firm Mishcon de Rea. And as you say, yes, she sat down with him and gave him this extraordinary account of how she felt in fear of her life.
Yes. And of course, I think Lord Mishcon is no longer amongst the living. But at the time when the crash happened, but rather extraordinary thing was, it seems extraordinary to me, is instead of making that note public, he first of all didn't do anything with it for about 3 weeks, and then he eventually took it to the Metropolitan Police, and they agreed to keep the note secret, and it was kept secret for about 6 years. That she had, predicted. I mean, at least that you would think that was a coincidence worth exploring. That somebody goes to their lawyer and says, "I'm going to be killed in a traffic accident," and then they are.
I think the question that people would raise is, if this was a big conspiracy, why hasn't anyone broken rank, talked about it? I mean, it was a chaotic day or evening of events. It's very difficult to see how that could have been pre-planned, and then it succeeded and no one has come forward and said, actually, I was involved?
Well, I think there were good reasons for people to say they weren't involved. I mean, there are a lot of peculiar coincidences. I don't know if you know that the head of MI6, I don't think this is a terrible secret to make public, the head of MI6 in Paris, and he resigned, or he stepped down from that role exactly at, I think, just after midnight on the night when the crash happened. And somebody else took over at that point.
One thing I should probably say, actually, is that we don't want to meet a white Uno. So we're not going to mention anybody's names today.
Well, you can.
Anyone who's alive.
I will snip that out. But I want to just go back to the motive. I mean, Andrew's right. I really want to get into the method. The motive, she does say something else. I mean, she's a little bit paranoid at this point. This document she gives to the lawyer, it's around the time she's talking to Martin Bashir. She had her own levels of paranoia. He's fed them because she's telling the lawyer that they want to kill me. That's so that Charles can marry the nanny, Tiggy Leg Bourke.
Tiggy Leg Bourke, yeah.
And there's quite a lot of slightly crazy stuff in this, and implausible stuff in what she says. But the other motive, though, that John gets into, which I found was really interesting, is that he's convinced that she was pregnant, and that it says that the postmortems and the autopsies were all covered up, and they were kind of not done properly and openly.
Yes.
So there's a second motive, which he claims, really got up the skin of the royal family.
I would say at that time, I mean, I think there were good reasons to think she might have been pregnant, but even if she hadn't been, I think, if you look back at the coverage at that time, there was a lot of speculation. There was a famous photograph taken on board the Fayed's yacht where she looked like she was pregnant. I don't think the time scale actually works out that she could have been, because she hadn't known Dodi for long enough at that point to have been visibly showing pregnancy. But, motives are about what people think are happening rather than necessarily what is happening. But it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, he goes into great detail of this, that there was an obsession once Diana was dead with getting her embalmed, and particularly sending a very inexperienced young embalmer there to extract all the urine from her body, because that's one of the ways you can conduct a test quite easily. And I think also, by that point, her blood had been so contaminated that there was no longer a sort of simple test that could be done. But I seem to remember in John's looking at the, I'm just trying to remember this, the Salpêtrière, isn't it? The hospital she was taken to. In the end, her body was taken to, that there were sort of marks on there suggesting that she possibly was pregnant initially. It's so difficult to know. I mean, John's gone very forensically through it. Hospital was suspicious about Diana's death. They ticked a box immediately on her death certificate saying that there was a suspicious accident, but that was very, very quickly sort of overruled by people higher up. I mean, I'm aware when you start talking about this, you rapidly sound like a mad conspiracy theorist because you start pulling.
I suppose, we find this fascinating. And I would say one thing about the book, it really does raise, it raises several things I find persuasive, that it knits them all together in a way I'm not sure I do, if I'm honest. When he starts bringing in Blair and Chirac and Bill Clinton and private secretaries and the CIA, and I mean, that is just a very, very big thing.
But there are a lot of unexplained questions.
This country we live in finds it difficult to organise traffic cones. So I think organising that might be a challenge. But
that's when I first got involved in making the film about the inquest. My view was that it was an accident, because I thought, as people tend to, you couldn't have a conspiracy. There'd have to be so many people involved in this conspiracy. But by the end, I'm not so sure, because I think it's quite possible to be involved in a conspiracy without knowing you're involved in a conspiracy.
Well,
I think there are various levels in, the law, obviously in the civil service, in the intelligence services, where the natural reaction is to be defensive and is to dismiss things and to hide things. And I don't think that's because everybody knows there's a big conspiracy. They just have a vague sense that it's better if this document or whatever doesn't come to the public attention.
Well, he certainly makes a good case, I think, that she's being kept under surveillance. He makes a good case, I think, that there are things happening in Paris involving spooks. And he makes a good case that the Ritz in particular is a place where people are often paid for information, and there's an awful lot of kind of, slightly kind of spooky activity going on. All of that I found quite persuasive.
But also,
I mean, one thing
strange. Paul Henry, was he argues was sober. He has all these unexplained payments. He wasn't someone who had ever driven people before. There are a lot of very strange things that happened on the night. And
this is the driver. Andrew's talking about the driver, Paul Henry.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I mean, one of the things is, there was a great attempt to portray him as a drunk and as a chronic alcoholic. And yet 4 days before the crash happened, he was also a pilot in his spare time, and he'd had his annual test, which is very thorough if you're a pilot. It's much more than just a few simple tests. And he got a clean bill of health for that. And also, if you've watched, you can find it online, or we use some in our documentary of the CCTV footage from inside and outside the Paris Ritz on the night. You can see him a few minutes before he gets off to drive the car, getting down, sort of kneeling. He goes down and I don't know if you do that, but you kneel down and tie one shoelace and then swap legs and do the other one. At the inquest, there was an expert, for what they're worth, who said that you simply cannot do that if you're drunk because your sense of balance will go. And he certainly doesn't look at all drunk.
I find it hard enough sober these days, I have to be honest.
Well, yes, that's what I was thinking. Thank goodness.
I've got to the stage of leaning against the wall to help.
And also, there were all these stories about the motorbike paparazzi, and there seemed to be extra bikes there that weren't accounted for. And even a London lawyer had testimony that he saw people fleeing. There's a suggestion that actually they were forced into the Alma tunnel by the bikes, that actually he could have gone another route, but forced that way.
And one of the interesting things I mentioned earlier, the Paget report that the Metropolitan Police had done. If you actually look in detail at the Paget report, the summaries of each section say, "Oh, there's nothing to see here; it's all easily explained." But if you actually look at the evidence, it's very different. And there was you'll have to bleep out if I can't mention any names, but it's in the public domain. DCI Carpenter was one of the police investigators, and they did a very thorough analysis of where all the paparazzi were, because the paparazzi are people with professional connections to newspapers. They're not just people who turn up on a bike because they have to have somebody that they know they can rapidly send pictures to get them published, because that's their job. And the DCI Carpenter was able to account for where all the paparazzi were. And apart from one motorbike that had Romuald Rat on RAT and was ridden by Stefan Darmont, all the others could be accounted for, and they were nowhere near the car at the time of the crash. And yet numerous witnesses say that they saw several motorcycles. So those were certainly unexplained. They don't seem to have been part of the paparazzi.
This is an interesting example, though, of John's method, I think. It's a bit suspicious that the car appears to have been surrounded by motorcyclists who have never been identified. And that is interesting. There are quite a few motorcyclists in Paris, but, is it suspicious? Well, he then from that jumps to the thought that maybe it's the SAS acting on behalf of MI6. And that's, I guess, at the point I start to think, well, this is putting two and two together and getting 512.
But there is also this chap, James Adamson, who seems to have been involved. Can you tell us a little bit about him? And because, he had this very mysterious death too.
Yes, well, look, things about him. He was a paparazzo, if that's the correct singular. It's known that he had a white Fiat Uno. He lived about 100 miles or so outside Paris. But yes, there was, at the time of the crash, there were denials that a white Fiat Uno had been involved. The police said, no, this is just fabricated. But eventually, after about 2 weeks, they had to admit that there was paint from a white Fiat Uno that was found on the body of the Mercedes where there'd been a collision. And, it's possible through chromatography to identify exactly where paint comes from. So at that point, they acknowledged that there had been a white Fiat Uno in collision, and they made a not very serious attempt, in my opinion, to try and find it.
And also the
Adamson,
MI6 agent, Richard Tomlinson, said that there was a paparazzi working for MI6 and he thought it might have been Anderson.
yes, I interviewed Richard Tomlinson, incidentally. I mean, if we can mention him, because he was no longer in MI6 by that point. I mean, he's an interesting character because I had to interview him in France because he'd been told if he came back to Britain that he would be arrested. And about 9 months, well, I interviewed him a few months after the inquest finished. And then a few months later, I heard from him that he'd been told by MI6 that now he was allowed to come back. I think once the inquest was out of the way, they were no longer bothered what he was saying so much. But yes, I mean, he said numerous things that he'd, firstly, that when he worked in MI6, he'd come across a plan for an assassination of a Serbian leader, because the Serbian conflict was happening back in the mid-90s, of causing a crash in a tunnel. So there would be very few witnesses and there'd be a lot of concrete around, and that it would be a crash that would be made to look like an accident. And that's, of course, about a Serbian leader. But I mean, it shows that MI6 had that kind of plan in their thinking. And secondly, he didn't mention Henri Paul as definitely the person, but he knew that there was somebody working in the Paris Ritz who was also connected to the intelligence services and had a pilot's license, which Henri Paul did. So there were reasons to think that it might well have been him.
And this man, James Anderson, we didn't quite finish him before. Yeah. John's theory, I think, is that he was MI6 asset or agent who'd worked a little bit as a paparazzo, but was also doing kind of jobs for the government, for the British government. And it's possible that he was driving this Fiat Uno, which many people believe, well, it obviously did nudge at some point the car, the Mercedes, in the tunnel with Diana inside it. And then he ends up meeting a very strange death, doesn't he?
Well, his death was, excuse me, certainly unusual. He was found in a burnt-out car in a field, and I think the fireman who found him said that he had 2 bullet holes in his head, and it's quite an odd way to commit suicide, it seems to me. Although suicide was the verdict that was brought in to, not only set yourself on fire but shoot yourself in the head twice. It's quite a tricky way to go.
That is a very strange story. This was in France, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So, I mean, is this to send out a message? Because, I mean, in some ways, one would do it in a much more subtle way than that. If it wanted to show it was a cover-up as a sort of suicide. This does raise questions. And this either is a bit of a cock-up, because they thought presumably the body would be burnt and it wouldn't be discovered. Or was this a deliberate sign that actually, if we can come after you if you speak?
Yes, I mean, I don't know. I mean, at this point, I'm dependent on John le Carré and people for knowing how the intelligence services operate. I mean, I'm not claiming any great sort of in-depth knowledge about that in particular, but it certainly seems very peculiar.
And I mean, the other thing was that it took a long time. I mean, Diana was alive and talking when the medics got there. And yet they took an awful long time to get her to the hospital and didn't go to the obvious close hospitals. Is this because she had to be treated? I mean, she was too injured to move and they treated her on the spot, which I understand is the French system rather than us who take people to hospital. Or is this, again, were there reasons for that? Because, I mean, John talks about people not identified in the ambulance. And, I mean, again, very strange things that were not questioned in any of the inquests. And I think we should also say that the last inquest with Justice Baker came down in favor of a criminal act and with these vehicles running behind her.
Yes, I mean, I'll go back to the ambulance, but the verdict is very important because I think almost everybody thinks that the verdict was accidental death. I mean, if they have any opinion at all, that it was just an accident. And in fact, what the jury said, the jury weren't allowed by the coroner to even consider a murder verdict, but they brought in unlawful killing, which in law is homicide or manslaughter. And it means a criminal act has been committed and that therefore the police should have been following up then to try and find out more about that. But none of that ever happened. Effectively, unlawful killing was treated as though it was the same thing as accidental death, which it clearly isn't. But yes, going back to the ambulance and the treatment, I mean, Diana was clearly injured in the back seat. There's a whole story about seatbelts, which John goes into as well. The seatbelts appear to have been disabled in the rear seats. So that, is yet another very peculiar thing, because seatbelts don't stop working. I mean, they're such a central part of the safety procedure of a car that they seem to have been deliberately sort of disabled so that they wouldn't work.
And this was a car from a car firm called Esquire, wasn't it? Who
I can't remember the name of the firm, but
normally produced their own drivers.
It was a car that you could have specifically sort of known that car would be available at that time. It wasn't just a random one. There were attempts made at the inquest to suggest, you couldn't possibly have known in advance which car it would be. But I think John shows quite persuasively you could have done. But yes, Diana, I mean, it took about an hour and 46 minutes from when the crash happened till she finally got to hospital. And it's about sort of 3 miles. And this was late at night in Paris when there isn't that much traffic around at sort of midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. She was left, I think, for about 35 minutes in the back seat of the car. Even though there were numerous medical people around, there were people who John thinks were working on behalf of the intelligence services who were keeping the other medical people away. Obviously, not everybody who turned up there was involved in some conspiracy, but there seemed to have been key people who were. And eventually, when she was taken into the back of an ambulance, instead of the ambulance taking her to hospital, they just kept her there for a very long time. And then even when the ambulance did drive towards the hospital, it drove very slowly and then stopped and waited for about another 5 or 10 minutes before it got her to hospital. And she seems to have been dead at that point. There was a lot of was made of the different systems in Britain and France, because in Britain, yes, the object is to just get somebody in a car accident and get them to hospital very, very quickly. In France, they have better equipped ambulances, I think, and they try and stabilize you at the scene, but they still try and get you to hospital as quickly as possible. They're aware, particularly if there's something like thoracic damage, which there was with Diana, that you have to be in hospital for that because it requires surgery. And instead, before they even put her in the ambulance, she was in the back seat of the car for well over half an hour. And then when she was in the ambulance, all the things they seemed to have done to her were injecting her with drugs that would actually increase internal bleeding. It's sort of extraordinary. And also, yes, several of the people who were in the ambulance have never been officially identified, which seems quite remarkable when you're having a 6-month-long inquest. That such a basic fact is just that a lot of these people are never even identified.
Well, that's all. That's fascinating. And although I started to shake my head a bit when John, because there are 2 doctors who treat her, one initially and then another one comes along.
Yeah.
And John ends up saying both these doctors are part of the plot. So now you've got ambulance staff. And
there are 3 altogether that he mentions, because there's one.
It's just this plot just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And is it really plausible that somebody who spent their whole life caring for patients is recruited to make sure this very famous woman dies and then never talks about it? And people in the ambulance don't look at them and say, what are you doing? You're doing it all wrong. This is where, to me, the strands begin to separate. Sorry.
Well, yes, I suppose people are under pressure. I mean, saying, if you want your pension, then, you need to say certain things. But I agree, to behave like this to start with seems unusual for people, who are trained doctors.
Yes, it would be. But, I think it is. No, I mean, it's difficult if we're not going to mention names.
John, names, sorry to interrupt, names a lot of people. And I mean, was there ever any reaction to the book? Did anyone actually write him legal letters, or did they just ignore it? He
didn't tell me. I mean, we'll get on to this, but I mean, I got to know John pretty well over the next sort of 7 or 8 years. He didn't tell me they'd ever been threatened or silenced, because obviously, his books, they were quite widely read, but they were completely ignored by mainstream media. And it's a double-edged thing, isn't it? If you start threatening someone or suing someone, that you then often generate a lot more publicity. So I think the attitude was just to try and ignore him, basically.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there have been a number of books on Diana's death which argue very similar things to him. I mean, raise all
Yeah.
sorts of questions, and indeed documentaries, often made by very reputable companies. So I mean, in some ways, he was not just a lone voice. There were others saying very, very similar things, weren't there?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's a sort of psychological the version of this about why people are conspiracy theorists. It's just when somebody famous dies, some people just can't accept that they've died in a banal way, like in a traffic accident. So they have to come up with elaborate conspiracy theories. And I used to think that, to be honest. I mean, when Diana died, I just thought people had gone start raving mad when, I was hearing strange things. And I just thought it's a traffic accident. It's a drunk driver. It was only years later, because I got involved in this documentary and the inquest, that I started to find a lot of the detail. And then you realize, almost everything you've been told about this story is either untrue, or at least it's not in the way that you were told it. You're told one bit of the facts, but not others.
And I mean, there's some very respectable figures like Michael Mansfield, the lawyer, who have raised questions about the death. I mean, who else apart from Mansfield?
Well, Mansfield's interesting, incidentally, because he refers to John Morgan's books as the magnum opus on all of this, and has said that he referred to them regularly because John had laid everything out. But whenever he does sort of mention a fact or a bit of transcript from something, it will always be detailed references, so you can find it again and cross-check it. I mean, many other people, because Mohamed Al Fayed was such a controversial figure. I mean, it was interesting because he died recently that he got quite sympathetic obituaries, it seemed to me. But of course, he was treated like a madman by the mainstream press.
Well, he was. Years. But I think going back to the part of the book that I found particularly persuasive and interesting was the surveillance, the attempts to undermine Diana. We've done programs about this, and I've actually written the book myself, which very much takes her side against the firm and some of the very, very nasty things that were done to her and said about her. But I mean, John really does lay out how she was being monitored, maybe slightly harassed officially, and even suggests some of her friends were actually feeding information back to the spooks.
There was a woman, Simone Simmons, who I also interviewed subsequently, who was quite a close friend of Diana's in the last year or two of her life. And she says, I mean, this is on the public record, that she says this happened, that when she was with Diana about 6 months before the crash, that Diana received a phone call, and it was from Nicholas Soames, who was then a junior Minister of Defence, saying to Diana that about the landmine campaign, that she should stop interfering in things she knows nothing about and that accidents can happen. Nicholas Soames denies that call ever took place, but Simone Simmons says that she was there and corroborates Diana's version of that.
Gosh, Soames, of course, was famously the man who went on to Newsnight the evening that the Panorama interview was broadcast.
And said she seems to be in the advanced stages of paranoia, yes.
Correct. But he was one of Charles's closest mates.
Yes,
because I mean, if John is arguing that the intelligence services were behind this, I mean, he also infers that members of the royal family briefed them on this, or were certainly aware of it. And that seems extraordinary, to have members of the royal family involved in an assassination in which the mother of the future king is being killed. I mean, it seems, the royal family have been criticised, but no one has really ever accused them of being party to murder before.
Well, John
no, but Diana,
except John,
it's either in Diana's legal note with Lord Mishcon, or it's in the note that she wrote to Paul Burrell, her butler, where she does specifically say that Prince Charles is planning to have me killed or seriously injured in a car accident. I mean, that's what she said. That's not proof, of course, but what is extraordinary is that those things were covered up for so long. I mean, if I can just make a general point here, one thing I've gradually understood more and more, not just about this, but about stories in general, is whoever gets their narrative in first when a big event happens has kind of got the high ground then. And if you can get in the stories with an accident with a drunk driver, it doesn't really matter if you can show that actually none of the samples that were taken from the driver show that he was drunk and so on, because the narrative's already established that this was a drunk driver. it was a crash, nothing to see, move on. Only loony conspiracy theorists think there was anything more to it.
I think he's very good. Sorry to interrupt. Is when he shows that they're often conflicting and changing testimony from lots and lots of people, including senior police officers and others involved. Evidence that was given on oath in two inquests, and you've got to ask, why do people keep changing their story, and why were there very inconsistent accounts of the same events?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean is true, and the police actually at the inquest admitted they'd broken the law by suppressing that Mishkon's note, because there was even though the French conducted their inquiry first, there was a British coroner appointed almost immediately after the death, and the police have a legal obligation to make any relevant evidence available to the coroner, and they didn't for about 6 years.
Sorry, going walkabout. Keep talking. Yeah.
But also, Paul, I mean, there's also a suggestion that the post-mortem reports and the toxicology reports about Dodi and Diana were never really shown to the jury. Is that right? Because that seems an extraordinary lapse.
Well, there was several extraordinary things. One was that virtually no French witnesses came to the inquest, even though Britain at that point was part of the European Union and they were obliged to come. The French government stepped in and said that they didn't need to come. And then secondly, the jury, about 2 months into the inquest, I think felt that they were having the wool pulled over their eyes, and they wrote a note to the coroner saying, well, all these French witnesses who aren't coming to the inquest, the people who did the toxicology, the police and so on, they all gave statements to the Metropolitan Police for the Paget report, and therefore we want to see those if we can't see the witnesses themselves. And the coroner wrote back and said, you're not allowed to see them. And that strikes me as so extraordinary. I mean, one of John Morgan's many benefits to us all is that somebody sent him copies of most of these afterwards, and he published them all in another book. So you can at least read that. But the fact that the jury were not allowed to hear from, most of the people who were involved in the immediate aftermath of this, of the police, of the people doing the autopsy, doing the blood samples. And there are extraordinary things about the blood samples of the driver Henri Paul, for instance, that blood samples were tested and were shown that he had a very high alcohol level, and blood samples were tested for DNA that showed it was his DNA. But the same blood sample was never tested for both. And that is just extraordinary, because it's such a basic thing that you would do. So there is no way of knowing that the blood sample that was tested for high alcohol level was actually Henri Paul's at all.
And the labelling was not very accurate, so it was very difficult for people later to check, wasn't it?
Yes, but the Metropolitan Police actually tried to, and because at that point they were still stored, and it was Dr. Pepin who had done the samples of the blood samples, who actually said that you're not having the blood samples unless the President of France and the Queen of England say that they must have them. And then very soon after that, they were destroyed.
That's amazing. We are slightly running out of time. I want to say two things. You talk about your documentary. I'm sure some of our listeners and viewers would love to watch it. Is it available anywhere?
There were all sorts of problems about it. You probably will find it somewhere on that thing they call the internet.
What's it called?
Unlawful Killing.
Unlawful Killing.
I think if you put Unlawful Killing, Diana, Keith Allen was the presenter of it.
Got it.
With Victor Lewis Smith and I and Keith all sort of wrote it between us. And hopefully it's there. It gets taken down every so often, but usually there are lots of people out there who pop it up again. So
we couldn't possibly endorse. We couldn't possibly endorse that.
We'll stick the link up, and clearly a link to John's book. I mean, Is there anything finally, Paul, that you feel we haven't covered that you think makes the case, or questions that remain unanswered?
I think it's difficult. I mean, it's not that there's one smoking gun; it's that there are hundreds of things that have little wisps of smoke coming out of them. Really, I don't think there's one. Nobody's stood up and said it's a fair cop. I did it, and I don't think that's very likely. and it's probably one of those things like the assassination of John F. Kennedy and so on, that even though, there are so many things that you just think, well, the official story just is not plausible, but it's very difficult to ever sort of pin anyone down completely. And, I almost admire the way sort of powerful establishments just steamroller on, basically, and they delay and they obfuscate. I mean, it's incredible that the inquest took, 10 years after the crash to happen. All these things, that there are ways that...
Well, that's a very good point, because we're often on here complaining. Just last week we were complaining at the way that the allegations about cash for honours with Charles were just shoved under the carpet, pushed into the long grass, all the other euphemisms people use for not doing their jobs. So,
I've been
it is a very British thing.
I've been rewatching old episodes of Yes Minister recently, and I mean, I think a lot of those stand up very well, because I think a lot of the wisdom about, yes, push it into the long grass, set up a committee that isn't going to report for 3 years, just let time move on, really, and people are replaced, and it doesn't matter how. It seems to me that it is quite clearly not a simple accident. And even the jury, who weren't allowed to see most of the evidence, even the jury said this is not an accident. This is an unlawful killing. There's more to it than that.
Do the sons feel? I mean, doesn't Prince Harry feel that? I mean, I think William blames the paparazzi, but I think Harry feels that there's more to the story, doesn't he?
I've heard that. I mean, I don't have any direct contact, and I'm always, slightly suspicious about Chinese whispers and so on that come through. But I have heard, yes, that both of them, are suspicious about what happened to their mother. But probably, being, well, I mean, Harry's kind of not really within the royal family very much now, I suppose. But it's difficult to because what happened with Diana? I mean, she was a squeaky wheel, wasn't she? And whatever you think the reason is, she died at a young age, and a lot of people were certainly relieved that she died at a young age. Whether it was an accident, I can't hand on heart say I 100% know what happened, but I think there's a lot more to it than an accident. But it was certainly very convenient to a lot of powerful people.
Yes, it could have been. Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?
Yes, indeed. Well, you've given us so much to think about. For 50 minutes, 50 minutes of it.
Well,
it's a very complicated story to explain. Is. I mean, John takes 700 pages or whatever, so you've done a brilliant job in encapsulating it.
Yes.
Well, I have.
Very interesting to talk to you.
I mean, John wrote lots of books. There's actually this other one, if I hold it up, that he did, Paris London Connection, which is only about 190 pages. And that was his deliberate attempt to synthesize it down even more to just tell the story. I mean, inevitably, because he's reduced it to that, then, you have to go to the other books to get the fine detail and check. But as a basis for anybody who's going to be listening to this, who's interested, I'd recommend Paris London Connection, which you should be able to get via Amazon.
We'll put that link up on the website. And many thanks.
Good. Well, thanks. It's nice to talk about it. It's been a few years since I was involved in it all.
Thank you so much, because it's difficult to talk about a book that's not, your own. But you've covered a lot of very, very interesting points, and we'll be very interested to hear what readers feel about it and what their own thoughts are.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Speak to you soon.
Good. Right. Oh, I hope it encourages a lot of people to read some of these books. Yeah. Right. Thanks, then.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Gosh, are you persuaded?
Well, I feel a little sorry for John, don't you? I mean, he obviously had no idea he had these awful health complaints. And, you have this idea of this sort of man with this obsessive interest, maybe too obsessive in this event, but he also picked away and found lots of things that are a bit off.
Yeah, it is very forensic.
Are you persuaded, Andrew?
Well, I think there are a lot of unanswered questions. And I mean, I think a lot of people should have been called who weren't called. A lot of people changed their story. I think it's certainly ripe for more investigation. I think there's still a book to be done, maybe bringing everything together and trying to answer some of these anomalies. So I don't think she was murdered, but I do think that there are a lot of unexplained elements here, and there's more.
I think there's people are out to get her in various different ways. Of that, I'm convinced. That she was under surveillance, I think I'm convinced. Whether they were out to get her in terms of ending her life, I'm probably not convinced. But actually, I was thinking about something that at the beginning of my career, I worked at World in Action, the investigative show. It's come up now and again in some of our programs. I think Andy Verity spoke about how he used to love it. And for a while, we got very excited by a story about cancer clusters because some journalists and lawyers found all these cases of childhood leukemia around nuclear power stations. And this case had a lot of weight and momentum, and it was taken to various tribunals, and scientific investigations were held, and it was going to go to court. And a lot of families who'd lost children, got quite, wound up, excited, angry about this. And then it all sort of came apart because other people started doing analyses of the same data. And they said, well, you could plot cancer deaths like this around pubs called the Black Bull, or factories beginning with the letter S, or any other sort of random number of things. And the human mind kind of wants to see a pattern when actually sometimes there isn't one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think people clearly, it's very hard to comprehend that something so trivial and so stupid as just getting into a car with a drunk driver should have all the ramifications it had, and people want, answers. I'd be very interested to hear what listeners feel. And I mean, there may be people who've read a lot of these books. There are lots of them. Neil Botham is another one. There's a man called John Bryant that I represented. So I think it would be interesting to hear what other people feel and where perhaps they feel there are questions still to be explored. But it shows the Diana industry is not dead.
Well, as an agent as well as a writer, Andrew, you would know what publishers actually want when you pitch them a book. My guess is somebody pitched them a book to say, everything's what you think. You got into a car, it was a drunken driver. They would probably say, boring. Am I wrong?
Exactly. It's like diets. Diets that tell you to eat less don't sell. Diets that tell you to eat just tomatoes are bestsellers. So there is an element to that. But also it's timing. I represented a man called Lee Sampson, who was the bodyguard who wasn't on that night, but spent the summer with her. And I couldn't sell that book for years. And it actually, I think, came out for the 25th anniversary with another agent. But it just shows you that the sort of waxes and wanes, the interest in Diana. It's not perhaps as constant as one thinks, or at least the gatekeepers, the publishers, didn't feel that was the case. I mean, I'm just amazed looking at Amazon and the number of reviews, for example, Andrew Morton has, and that his book still is up there as a bestseller. So it shows that in some ways, if you have an inside story, someone who's very well regarded, those books tend to last. I mean, there's so many rubbish royal books around. I'm reviewing one at the moment, and you just wonder how these books ever got published sometimes.
Well, look, thank you for that. I enjoyed that. Thanks you for making me do it. It was interesting.
Good. Well, you're going to make me get it.
We did promise our viewers and listeners that we'd have better technical quality, and I'm sorry, that last interview wasn't that, but we are working on it.
Yeah, it will get better. But I mean, it was very good of him because he was speaking about someone else's book. But yeah, no, I think it's good that we go to places that we may not necessarily feel that there's another point of view. I think that's always very important, to look at other points of view. All
right, well, we'll do a program about how Lord Mountbatten was a tremendous war hero who's been sadly maligned by all sorts of grubby hacks like Mr. A. Lowy.
Exactly. Yes, I can think of several people who would appear on that program.
All right, mate. Very good talking to you. See you soon.
Okay. Until next week. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.